Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office for part two of the medieval period that leads us into the Renaissances. So let's just dive right in. I've got three particular theorists that I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to start off with Christine de Pizan, move on to Peter Ramus, and then finally, not Kevin, but Sir Francis Bacon. And the reason I'm going in that order is because I believe that's the order in your book, but also because it's chronological. So obviously, women weren't recognized as public speakers or even as educated individuals during the Middle Ages. I mean, we weren't educating anyone for the most part. If you want to look outside of the Holy Roman Empire, the church, you can find other progressive writers, people who were still exploring the nature of life and the nature of science. You can find them. Certainly finding women would be much more rare. So how do we end up with someone named Christine de Pizan? Most of the time, you'll find that she is studied in French literature courses at the graduate level. She is not someone that is normally put into rhetoric. I think initially they put her there because they just needed some women to sort of fill out the very skewed male-dominated history. But the fact of the matter is that she does have some things to tell us that I think are important, although at the time I don't think she intended them the way that we now interpret them. But that's a different debate. I think we can learn something from her. So who is she? Christine de Pizan was born into not royalty, but into an upper class because her father was an assistant to the king. Because he was an assistant to the king, she was afforded an education that most people were not, particularly that most women were not. She was offered this because she was around it so often and because her father believed that she should be educated and able to support herself. She did marry. She had several children. I don't remember how many. And very early in life, before she was 30, I believe, she had lost her father. She had lost her husband. So she had herself, her children, and her mother-in-law to take care of. How did a woman provide in these times? Well, one of the things that she did because she could was she wrote poetry, right? Like she wrote beautiful pieces of poetry for, if you want to sort of romanticize it, for like the knights who wanted to woo their ladies. They would send them a letter. If you saw A Knight's Tale, I realize that movie is quickly aging, but it's still an awesome movie. If you watch that, you see them all get together to write a letter for William. So she did that. She sold these to the knights so that they could use them. In that way, she was a practicing rhetorician. But that's not what's important. What's important is once that became not enough to sustain her, she and her family, she went ahead and wrote two works that are pretty important. The City of Ladies and the Treasury of the City of Ladies. And I don't remember what parts we have you reading, but I'm sure they're the typical parts. So hopefully most of this is not brand new to you if you get a chance to read Christine de Pizan first. So first of all, she in these books, what she's doing is really talking to upper class women, particularly those who are with the princes. Honestly, it's the courtiers, right? The courtiers are the ones who are at court when the king and queen hold court, or when there is a royal meeting of some kind, the courtiers are invited. And you have to have a certain pedigree to go to the court. And so she was writing for these women. In fact, she addresses this to the princesses at one point. they were not necessarily designated as princesses, but they were potential princesses for sure. So what did she write about? Etiquette? That's how it was originally taught. To me, when I was in your position, I was taught that Christine de Pizan wrote an etiquette book. That's not correct. If you read it, she really talks about how to use language and nonverbal communication to sort of steer and guide the princes, their husbands, their boyfriends, whatever, to guide them in the right direction. Similar to Aspasia from ancient Greece. So she sort of, yes, there's some etiquette to it, but it's an etiquette geared towards the ladies helping their gentlemen. And I say that because at this time, that would have been all you would have heard about. These ladies giving to their gentlemen guidance and the support that they needed to make the right choices. That's one thing. The second thing this writing did was it helped women in those positions understand how they could move up and gain favor in the court. If they were single and were competing for the hand of someone specific, this guide could sort of help you understand how to present yourself, not just as a spoiled brat, but as someone who could be helpful to the prince. In other words, intelligence and common sense were emphasized over brains and beauty. Or over beauty, excuse me. Brains over beauty is what I'm trying to say. Now, what's interesting about this is if you look at some of the more recent recreations of certain stories where you have a prince come in and save the princess and all is well and they lived happily ever after, right? A lot of those are being redone. They're being redone because women are kind of like, we're not like that anymore. And men are kind of like, we're not like that anymore. Nobody's like that anymore. In the sense that those aren't the lessons that we need. We don't need prim and proper etiquette for ladies. We don't need men to fight on horseback with swords or whatever it is that they did back then, right? What we need now is to understand that, men and women and others can be who they want to be. And that was sort of Christine's point. So she, say for example, I've been thinking of so many of these. A Knight's Tale. I can't remember the name of the movie, but there's a Drew Barrymore film that's sort of a take on the Cinderella story that has Dougray Scott in it, and it's all about the pedigree and the education versus beauty and materialism. It's a version of the Cinderella story, and it's a pretty cool one. I like it a lot. There's also a new Cinderella movie coming out, and from what I've seen, this one is very, very different. There was a Cinderella movie, I think, was it Monique? Who was in it? I can't remember who played the princess, but it was an awesome, very diverse cast. It was a musical. It was only on TV, I believe. And all of these, what they're doing is starting to empower the women to not put so much pressure on the men to do what they have to do. It's more about choice. Well, of course, back in the medieval period, we think nobody had a choice. Nobody had a choice to do anything. You either were working on a fiefdom as a peasant and a servant, or you were serving a knight, or that knight was serving a lord, or that lord was serving a king, and your life was laid out for you based on who you were when you were born. Nowadays, we don't really have that problem. I mean, to some extent, there's definitely an advantage to being, I don't know, say a Kennedy over being hypothetically, a Dudash, right? There's certainly certain families that are dynasties that, are more likely to be involved in politics, be elected office, just based on the fact that they have more money, they can get away with more things, or they can do more good with it, depending on who the person is. So there's certainly that imbalance still, but it's not nearly what it used to be, okay? Not nearly anything like the medieval period. So if we read de Pisson's works with the sort of hindsight is 2020, we see that what she's really doing is trying to help women stay within the parameters of the etiquette of the time, the socially acceptable things to do, but still moving themselves into better positions in some way or another. I've been teaching this course for 16 years, and I have to say for 10 years, I was just teaching it sort of as I learned it, sort of as the etiquette book, a little bit about the persuasion. And somebody raised their hand, a student raised their hand, and they said, Dr. Dudash, this looks to me like it could be the start of organizational communication. And I thought that person was crazy for a second, because you always have that like immediate reaction, what? But I said, okay, tell me about that. And she said, well, she's in a hierarchy, obviously. She's in a structure. It's a social structure that's based on economics. And she wants to move up in the company, or she's trying to help people move up in the company and telling them how to manage those paths from where they are to where they want to be. And if nothing else, it teaches us where your place is does not necessarily make you who you are, that you can maneuver within the confines of your position in life. So I think that was a really cool way to think about it. I don't think that Christine intended that, but honestly, if I could sit down with her and have a chat about it, I don't speak French, but maybe we could find a way to communicate. If we were to sit down and talk about it, I don't think she'd be upset with that interpretation, especially in modern times, in that understanding. At least I hope not. So what are 3 things that Christine de Pissson gave us? Well, she gave us the sort of etiquette to know how to speak as a courtier, as a member of the court. She gave us a way of maneuvering in that court. And so she also gave us sort of maybe the beginning of understanding structures, social structures particularly, or corporate structures, and how they impact communication. Last but not least, one of the things I want to emphasize is that Christine does say you cannot do any of this without one very important thing, and that is virginity or purity, depending on how you interpret her. And to me, today, what that would translate to is your credibility as a human being, as a person. Because back then, women were basically only judged on how pure they were and what their quote unquote breeding was. Yeah, we were talked about like we were puppies. So she really says, if you don't have your reputation, you don't have anything at all. You cannot convince anybody to do anything. You will not succeed in the court. You will be forever shunned. And she's probably right. I believe that's exactly what they did. And in fact, in that Drew Barrymore movie that I still can't think of the name, that's kind of the point, is digging at that particular problem in that time period. And, Cinderella is actually a Russian story. It came out of Russia, and I'm just not real sure that we can democratize it that easily, but here we are. So it's that cross between fairy tale and reality is definitely an interesting exploration, which is why she's mostly taught in literature, in English departments and literature departments. So hope you found that fascinating, but remember those 4 things about Christine. All right, moving on, and this is actually jumping pretty far ahead, and I apologize for that. But as I explained in my last video, there's just not the time to go through everybody in this book. This is supposed to be a 2-semester course. Not that we've ever had it that way, but that seems to be what the book intended, so we could spend more time on these lesser known rhetoricians. Unfortunately, I have to jump right to Ramus. Peter Ramus. I love this guy. If you have not read this yet, you'll be entertained. If you have read it already, you probably were entertained. Let's face it, anybody who calls Aristotle a moron is interesting, if nothing else. Do I like his conclusions? Absolutely not. Did he have guts? Yeah, he did. He died basically because he was, I believe it's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Battle, if I recall correctly. I believe that's correct. And he was basically run out on rails. But prior to that, he didn't have a very easy life. Peter Ramus always wanted to be the chair of rhetoric. Cicero placed, as I told you before, placed rhetoric right in there in our educational system. It wasn't a question of whether or not rhetoric was taught. So Peter Ramus wanted to be the chair of rhetoric, wanted in philosophy, and they were like, no, you could be the law professor, which was, I guess, an insult. I don't really know. I mean, I'd love to be a law professor or chair, but obviously I'm not qualified for that. But he was, they had a more general education sort of idea about it, so he was qualified to teach, obviously. However, all of his academic career, and he had a decent one, but his entire academic career he was like, I don't know what other way to put this, so I apologize for the phrasing, but he was hell-bent, as my father would say, on taking down the foundational principles of rhetoric and philosophy. And by that, I mean, he was the man in black from The Princess Bride. I realize I've made a lot of references to 80s and 90s movies that you may have never seen, but these are movies you should see. How about that? I'm just going to give you that advice. They are definitely movies you should see for some lighthearted entertainment. In the Princess Bride, the man in black meets up with Vizzini, the evil guy who has kidnapped the princess, and they have a conversation. And in that conversation, Vizzini says, the man in black says, well, how smart are you exactly? And Vizzini says, have you ever heard of Socrates, Aristotle, Plato? And the man in black said, yes. And he goes, morons. And that's what I feel that Ramus is doing here. He's basically saying these guys are idiots, but he's really ticked off at Quintilian. What he does in the work that you're reading will literally change the course of history for rhetoric, the way that it's viewed, the way that it's used, and even today, some of its bad reputation comes from Ramus. How does that happen? Well, let's start off with what Ramus really has to say. First of all, he acknowledges that God has given us two gifts, because remember, we're still in that super rely on the church period. He was, although I believe this is after Martin Luther's 95 Theses, I believe. So there was a Protestant movement, but Ramus was still religiously based, especially in education. He said, God gave us two gifts. One gift is speech. The other gift is reason. Okay? Two separate gifts. And he believed that they should be kept separate because he says that, you can't ask someone who's a great oil painter to do pottery and expect it to be as great as their painting, right? You can't require somebody or judge somebody based on different standards than what they do. And he felt that Quintilian specifically, but the others as well, were requiring that to happen. They were requiring rhetoricians to not only speak well, but to also be good people, reason, know science, etc. And he thought, that's ridiculous. So he split up the idea of rhetoric from the idea of reason. These were two separate concepts. And by the way, when I say reason, during the medieval period, reasoning was considered scientific. So sometimes they referred to it as science. So reason or science, okay? So you have, under the realm of rhetoric was only style and delivery. That's it. That's what they focus on. Only the pretty stuff. Only the functional delivery of a message. That's it. The other three, which obviously would be invention, arrangement, and memoria, he says belong to the realm of reason or science. Now, I've been told sometimes in certain books it says that memoria is also with rhetoric. That's fine. I'm not that tied up in this. The way I learned it is that rhetoric is style and delivery only. It's empty, flowery language, which is a way that you might have heard rhetoric be used before. And certainly, I mean, today, of course, after the State of the Union, which was President Biden's only his first State of the Union because of COVID last year. So everybody's using the word rhetoric, and they're all using it wrong, in my humble opinion, right? Everybody else is wrong, I'm right. Or I should say we academics are right. Because when they say that's just rhetoric, what they're saying is that's just empty language. That's just good style and good delivery and nothing more. It's over there. Reason, on the other hand, taps into the way that the speech is sort of created, how well the arguments work, and he has different ways of proving this to be true. I say my air quotes. I hate people who use air quotes. Here I am. I have to. He proves this by doing a couple things. The first thing he does is disproves that Aristotle can do anything reasonable by trying to take down the concept of a syllogism. Now, Ramus is not wrong. A syllogism is not giving us any new information, but Aristotle never expected it to. He sort of went through the fact that these are just proofs that something is true, not a question of whether it's true. But what's really fun is I hope you all still have this in your part of the book, the original writing from Ramus, where he talks about Aristotle's syllogism, because he uses a syllogism to prove that Aristotle can't use syllogisms. But what's funny is it's a terrible syllogism. It's like it takes illogical leaps in the middle of it. From the major premise to the minor premise, I'm like, what are you talking about? That's doesn't even work, dude. So it's not in the major premise. It's not in the minor premise. It's not in the conclusion alone. It's the reasoning that would follow those three, the warrant, if you will. When we get to argument, we'll talk more about that. So it's kind of interesting to read, but not real helpful. His second biggest complaint is with Quintilian. He says that Quintilian talks about how great Cicero was, but Cicero said you needed to know everything. And then Quintilian adds onto it, a good person speaking well. Wait a minute. So now I have to be a good person to speak well? I have to be a good person to be a rhetorician? Well, yeah, Aristotle said that too, right? He said that your audience needs to feel that you have their best interests in mind. Remember the concept of goodwill. So that concept of goodwill means you have to be a good person with good intent and who tells the truth, because in credibility, you have to tell the truth. And remember, Aristotle also told Plato, look, if it's untrue, if somebody's telling lies, that's not rhetoric. Rhetoric is mass influence based on truths, well-reasoned truths, okay? And Ramus is just like, oh my God, That makes the definition way too broad. You are expecting way too much from this definition. So from then on, we had a huge division in the world of rhetoric. Those who studied style and delivery, the elocutionists, if you will, they focus on elocution. And those who focused on it as part of, or as a function of reasoning in science. These two, over the past, how many years has it been? It's been 300 years roughly. People have been trying to link them back together. They really have. And it has not worked. The reputation of rhetoric being so terrible is 100% impossible. Because of the way that you see us casually use those terms today. Oh, it's just rhetoric. Oh, it's just rhetoric? Well, let me tell you what goes into that, honey. But we can't say that anymore, because the truth of the matter is that when people say that's just rhetoric, what they're saying is it's empty language. It's flowery, it's pretty, it's elocution, it's eloquent, but it's not reasonable. It's not well-reasoned. It's not logical. All right. A couple of people will try to bring these back together. As I said, I'm one of them. Vico, who we'll be getting into soon. Not so much Bacon, but a little bit. And then when we get into the moderns, we're really going to see them struggle with this question of, can rhetoric be poetic and can poetics be rhetorical? In my opinion, the answer is yes, by the way, but we'll see what these other more well-known and established scholars have to say. So from Ramus, we get that God has given us two gifts, that they are speech and reason, that they are completely separate from each other, that they cannot join together, that under speech should only be style and delivery, and under an invention and arrangement and so on belong under the realm of reason and science. They're somehow scientific. And he also critiques definitions of rhetoric, specifically Quintilian's, for being overly broad. It overreaches, it asks for too much. And when you read his piece, enjoy the sarcasm, okay? Enjoy it. It's the thing about Ramus is that he was just a rabble-rouser. He was just a troublemaker who was banned from the academy for a long time, actually, because he kept trying to take down the foundational principles of our education system, which lie in the ancient Greek and Roman traditions. So that's Ramus. Finally, today, I'm going to talk about Bacon, one of my favorite people. I've heard a rumor that his mother's maiden name was Cook, and most of the time, with your one of your children took your maiden name into their names, and so, for example, I mean, I've always been upset that my mom's dad. His last name did not get carried on because he only had daughters, but none of those daughters ever named kids with his last name. And I always felt that they should have. And I probably would have done that had I had my own kids, but I didn't. So I've got 9 nieces and nephews, and none of them have the name in there. But we're not in the medieval period. Back then they did. If that's true, if those two things are true, if it is true, premise 1, that they put the middle name or the maiden name in as the middle name of a son or daughter, and if it is also true that they did this and if it is true, secondly, that Bacon's mom's last name, her maiden name before she married, was Cook, then his name is actually Sir Francis Cook Bacon, and I'm saying there's no better name than that. Sorry for the tangent. Just thought you might find that interesting. Bacon is our scientist right now. He is pulling us from the idea that rhetoric is nothing more than style and delivery, and begging us to focus on more empirical ways of knowing life and the truth. What do I mean by empirical? Anything that is empirical, empiricism, believes that we can know the world through our five senses. So taste, smell, hearing, feeling, and did I say smelling yet? I don't believe I did. Hearing, smelling, taste, feeling. What am I missing? Oh, that's right. Seeing. So just think about it as eyes, ears, nose, mouth, sort of way of, and fingertips, I guess, of thinking about it. That is what empirical means. That I can empirically prove something means that I can materially demonstrate it to you, either through your sight, through sound, through smell, through taste, or through feeling it. I can do that because anything that's empirically studied, you have to do that. As an example, if we were going to simply say, what color is this? Some of you might see it as black and white because my camera sucks. It's actually hot pink. So it's hot pink here on these streaks and then black. All right, that's empiricism. You saw what I saw, and we can probably agree for the most part on that. Maybe not perfectly, but we can agree for the most part. This reminds me of the whole, what was it? Was it white dress or blue dress? There was some dress thing that came up. And every now and then we see that our eyes actually play tricks on us a little bit. And we also know that our ears can do the same thing and our taste buds are all different. But we still use the term empiricism to reference the five senses and finding knowledge through the five senses. Okay? Bacon was big on that. He believed that we should come to understand the world through our five senses. But he also understood that in order to do that, your brain has to interpret what those senses are feeling, seeing, hearing, etc. So what happens then? So the first thing that he proposes in a work called, oh wow, sure. I totally forgot what the name of the work is. Is it On Reason? It may be. It's the first one, I think, that I had you read, where he talks about faculty psychology. He says that what happens is the brain is divided up into all of these different areas where talents and skills are put in there that you're born with. And so if you are not born with the talent for rhetoric, for speaking, or for writing, then you can never hone that skill. It's just not going to work for you. Clearly, I never got the math faculty at all, ever. I'm lucky I graduated, right? For me. If you imagine the brain sort of cut up into different little pieces and the faculties that you have, another faculty I don't have is music. I love music, but I can't sing, I can't write, I can't play. I'm lucky if I can clap in time. You know what I mean? And so these are things that, while I probably could have learned, it was too much work to learn those things because my brain had to work extra hard. I did not have the faculties for that. That's how they used to talk about it too. They used to say, well, she doesn't have the faculty to understand math. But that means that there's other talents that I do have that some people don't have. One of those happens to be, believe it or not, as shocking as it might be with these videos, public speaking. Another one of those happens to be my ability to not be nervous, to be poised when I'm in front of a large group. It just doesn't bother me. I'm one of very few people who are that way. Most people are that way, that they're nervous a little bit, but they can overcome it, right? With practice. And that's what Cicero talked about too. He said you have to have some talent And then you have to develop that skill. But he believed that you could do that, especially if you were taught from birth, like he said. So if this is true, that our brains are divided up into these areas, which sounds crazy, but if you think about it, we do know that certain parts of the brain control certain things. For example, the hippocampus, does different things than the frontal lobes. What do the frontal lobes do? Well, you've got your right frontal lobe and your left frontal lobe, and depending on who you talk to, those do different functions, but mostly they're associated with short-term memory. So one of the things that people will tell you when you study like nonverbal communication or something is that if a person is telling you the truth, they'll look up at you and to the right. Like if they're trying to remember something, okay, what did happen yesterday? And then I tell you, that means I'm telling you the truth. If you ask me a question and I'm like, oh God, I gotta lie my way out of this, I will look up and to the left. And the reason I do that is because the right side is the less creative, more historical memory, and the left side is more creative in trying to understand or trying to create what we would call, quite frankly, a lie. It's a fabrication. So if I don't want to tell you the truth, I'm going to be like, what do I tell them? Right? So if you don't want to ever be pegged as lying, always look up and to the right, I guess. I don't know, to be honest with you, how true that is, but it does seem to be sort of a handed down tradition of knowledge, a sort of, what do you call that? Like an old wives' tale or common sense or something that we humans have at least come up with, right? So that's interesting, I guess. It definitely introduces us to this idea that there has to be something there before there can be a development of it. You can't start from zero. However, faculty psychology leads to a very, very big problem in about the 1950s. Because these two hemispheres of the brain up front function the way that they do, they started blaming that for women's unpredictable behavior. Okay. Where that unpredictable behavior came from, whether it was a true psychopathy, whether it was, they blamed it on menstrual cycles, which I can't, I guess I'm just not that hormonal. I've never known anybody that hormonal. Yes, we're hormonal, but not like that. Men are hormonal. Come on, we're humans. But they blamed it on that sometimes, and they said my wife is crazy. And if you know who Nellie Bly is, you can read about how men could just put people into a psychiatric hospital without anything other than their words that she's crazy. In the 1950s, they wanted to try to find a way to help fix these hysterical women, if you will. And since they determined that the problem was that, between these two hemispheres, there was a problem, they started doing lobotomies. And of course, lobotomies is you take out part of the brain. Most, if not all of the women who had this operation died or suffered cruelly for their lives, very cruelly. Probably the biggest, most popular example of this is John F. Kennedy's oldest sister, who's I think her name was Rose Kennedy. She was out riding on a horse, and I think this is right. Don't quote me on how she got injured. I think it was that. But she injured her head, and from then on, they said she was a completely different person, and so they gave her a lobotomy. And that was not good. So this idea of faculty psychology, great. I love the idea. If I could just tap right here and suddenly figure out that, oh yeah, I can in fact do music, that would be fantastic. in any way, shape, or form. I can't carry any tune I can't even whistle. My daughter makes fun of me for that. She's 12 and she loves to make fun of me because I can't cross my eyes. I can't roll my R's, and I can't whistle. There are things I just can't do. I think we all have different talents, and perhaps a good argument for Ramus would be that even though I can't sing, I can't dance well, I can't do anything in that part of the art world. I don't write particularly well in the sense of creative poetry or anything, but I have a good talent for painting. I don't mean like houses. I mean paintings like flowers, mostly still life, mostly post-impressionist. But I have a talent for doing that. So there is an artistic talent. It's just different from some other people's artistic talents, and it's the same as others. That division of the brain into these sections is fascinating, but it led to some pretty disturbing ideas about how to fix people. But one of the other things that it did, and these things are really cool, was it gave us what's known as the Baconian method. Bacon, in his works, developed he developed essentially an inductive scientific method. It was called the Baconian method, and it was what we used before we ever got to a deductive scientific method that you hear about now. How did the inductive method work? What was Baconian, methods? Basically, he was really curious one day about whether or not you could freeze poultry and still eat it at a later time. So he went and picked up some fowl off the road. It wouldn't have been a chicken from what I understand back then. It might have been a turkey or a goose or a duck. And he packed it into snow, and he kept going back to it and looking at it. And before he could come to any conclusion, I think it was before he concluded, he died. I thought it would have been hilarious if he died, like ate the chicken or ate the poultry and died of salmonella. But of course, that's not what happened. The world is not quite that ironic or cruel. He actually died, I believe, from pneumonia, from going out into the cold and coming back in and not drying off, and caught a bad cold, which led to pneumonia, and then he died. Fascinating, isn't it? But, it's important to understand that he broke down the brain into faculties, into specific things that you could or could not do. And that includes rhetoric and that includes reason for him. They're two separate things. You can have a talent for rhetoric, but not for reason. And you can have a talent for reason, but not for rhetoric. And I'm sure we know a lot of people who are really good thinkers who can't present their ideas. And we know a lot of people who sound fantastic and have no idea what they're talking about, right? We can think of examples of both of those. Bacon sort of proves Ramus's thesis here, but then he gets funky. And in the second piece, which is called Novum Organum, see, I remembered one of them, which actually stands for new instrument. He sort of gave us this way of like explaining how it is that we think. So remember when I talked about the senses, the empirical information that we get, we have to interpret that empirical information before it can be shared. And so how does that happen, or what does that look like? So in Novum Organum, really what Bacon gives us is these, what he calls four idols, IDOLS, that distract us from the truth. So think of it sort of like a false idol, right? Instead of worshiping the right God, you're worshiping a false idol. Or instead of reading the real book, you're reading like a false impression of the book. Those kinds of things occur for a reason, okay? The idols are constantly present and constantly attempting to distract us from the truth. So we may make a scientific discovery made in the scientific deductive method. We might prove it to be true, but not see the whole of the truth because we're too busy thinking about one of these four idols, or we're too busy thinking with one of these four idols. So what are the four idols? The first one is the idol of the den or the idol of the cave. I don't care which way you refer to it. This idol is when we are stuck within our own mind, our own way of thinking, and we don't get out of it. So someone says to me, I don't think that you should cook spaghetti in a skillet, pasta, spaghetti noodles specifically. And I say, well, I do it all the time because that gets them the most evenly cooked and I like them al dente. And they say, well, you can't do that. You can't cook pasta in a skillet. That's because they haven't done it. It's outside of their experience. They can't see beyond themselves. Now, we all get caught in that trap, not necessarily with spaghetti cooking, but with important things where we have tunnel vision, or we're sitting in our cave in our head and we don't want to see anything outside of it. I think these days we call them not bubbles. What are we calling them? Maybe it is bubbles. Like the people who agree with us are the people who we're going to hang out with. It's not, is it bubbles? I can't. My brain is not working too well today. You understand what I'm saying, that we're going to align ourselves with people who agree with us. And my God, is there anything worse than social media to reinforce our way of thinking? There's all these millions of people who think just like me. It doesn't make it right? It doesn't make it true. So that's the idol of the cave. The idol of the, which one do I want to do next? Tribe. Let's do tribe. Now he uses that term, tribe. I'm not sure if that's considered okay or not, but what he means is the limitations that we have on us because we're human. We only have so much time. We are limited in our sight. We are limited in what skills we have. Human beings are limited by their just material structure. This isn't necessarily anything external or social. It's just how humans are. And it's true. We can't see everything. We don't have unlimited time either. So that's the idol of the tribe. We're human. The idol of the theater is next, I believe. And the idol of the theater is a more social, it's a cultural issue. What I mean by that is that we are often, I'm going to get this word out, awesome, although I can't get words, people. We are often sort of distracted by the things that we experience or the things that we've been told, and we don't ever want to work past that. And this can have serious implications, by the way. One of them for me is I got very, very ill in 2009. They told me I had like 3 months to live. Obviously, I lived longer. But I was diagnosed with a pretty serious and little known disease. It's an autoimmune disease. And, at the time, I don't think people had ever worked with that here in Springfield, the particular one that I had. I ended up in the emergency room. All my organs were shutting down. It was a pretty desperate situation. So for the past 12 years, I've been fighting against all of the sort of chronic problems that come with this illness. In fact, one of the reasons why we're doing this and we're not in a classroom together, which is where I'd much prefer to be, is because of my illness. So my mom thought I was crazy. I was flying to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I fly to Denver once a year. I'm just always constantly trying to get to the best clinics, the most recent research, because they are doing a lot more of it now. They're aligning it with MS, they're aligning it with RA, psoriasis, all these other autoimmune diseases that people are working on. And in Denver, it just so happens that they're studying sarcoidosis specifically. So I go up there, they study me. And so one of the things that they've been trying to do since 2009 was to put me into essentially what they call stage 0, which is sort of like a remission, but unlike cancer, after 5 years, you're not cured. It's still there. So it's going to be there until I die. But we just constantly are trying to beat back any symptoms. Okay. So for the first time since 2009, a year ago, I was told I was in stage 0 and I was in remission, if you will. And I felt better. I mean, things were going well. I had started using a new drug. And so I called my mom when I told her, oh my God, we've had success with this drug. I think it's going to work this time. And my mom suffers from psoriasis. And she's like, oh, really? I mean, it's bad psoriasis. It's rough. And she's like, oh, well, what is it? And I told her, I said, you could take it for your psoriasis. And she goes, oh, no, I am not doing that. And I said, why not? She goes, that's a chemotherapy drug. And I was like, yes, it is, but it works. And she goes, do you know the side effects of that? You could get cancer. Yes, Mom. Anybody can get cancer. It does lower your immune system. It doesn't mean I'm going to walk out and get lymphoma tomorrow. Like, she is so afraid of the word chemotherapy. She doesn't even understand what it means because she's like convinced I'm sitting somewhere with an IV, dripping into my arm. No, that's not it. It's actually a pill. There's a whole group of drugs that are called chemotherapy. They're chemically derived drugs. They're not biological. They don't come from somewhere. We've created them. And so she just has a real problem with the word. And so she rejects it because everything she's ever heard about chemotherapy is terrible. And that's probably right. But for me, my disease was pretty terrible. So I think I'm doing a lot better. Are there problems sometimes? Yeah, there are. There's always going to be. But, the word chemotherapy is not causing me trouble. My mother, on the other hand, it's been handed down to her that chemotherapy is a bad word. You stay away from it. You never touch it. Sort of old wives' tales sometimes too. But how we were raised, who raised us, where we were raised, what schools we went to, all impact this theater that we live in, and therefore guide us to think certain things over others. So we're limited by our experiences or by the experiences of those who have taught us. Okay? And by the way, this just naturally happens. This is not abnormal. It works for all of us. In fact, the first time my doctor mentioned a chemotherapy regimen for me, I was like, no, because my mom and dad had taught me not to ever take it. Never do that. So I had the same issue, but I got over it because I looked outside of my mom's experience with the word chemotherapy and found that it benefited me. All right. So that's sort of how the theater works. It's culture and how culture somehow interjects itself into our ability to know or to find truth. Last but not least is the marketplace. How is it that we share knowledge? What is the marketplace currency of knowledge? And the answer to that is language. There are obvious obvious things. If I get an article that is scientific and proves something true or not true or whatever, and it's written in French, I'm not hearing it. But that's not what, or I'm not getting it, I should say. I'm reading and don't know French, so that would be a problem. But that's not exactly what Bacon was talking about here. He was talking more about the way that meaning occurs. So my frame of reference, if you will, for certain words or language, or as some people say, turn of phrase, those things are different for other people. We can only get so close to using language. There's no 100% perfect sharing of meaning. There's always going to be some gap in between how I understand things and how you understand things and how everybody else understands. There's people that we communicate with and use language and we completely understand each other. I have a friend who I have not seen in probably 15, 20 years, and she and I still speak to each other in only Duran Duran lyrics. That's how we start every conversation that we have, is only with Duran Duran lyrics, which is crazy. If you listen to us, you're going to be like, what the hell? I mean, most of Duran Duran's songs don't make any sense. How are you going to make sense out of that? But it's sort of something that she and I came up with, our language, right? Our language. Most of the time, we're not that limited when it comes to the currency of finding truth. But there's only so many words. We pick words based on what we know. We don't create new words for when we're doing a scientific or a study of some kind. We don't randomly make up something. Later in life maybe, but not right now. We are limited by the numbers of words that we have. We are limited by the choices of language that we have. We're limited by the fact that words can only mean so many things, and that so many words can only mean one thing. And it can get a little bit hairy. But it doesn't mean that we can't all know truths or share truths. It just means that we have to acknowledge that we are limited by our language. And obviously language can distract us from the truth. Just the word love inspires so many thoughts that if somebody says to me, I love you, depending on who it's coming from, it's going to have multiple different meanings. I had a best friend since I was in first grade. We never said I love you until she was on her deathbed. And I was like, dude, I love you. She's like, I know. There are things that language actually does limit, and we can't describe certain things. I don't know if you've ever had that problem before where you can't describe something. There's no word for what it is that you want to share. Well, when we're studying in empirical science and we come across something new, which we always hope to do, we don't have words for it. So we somehow have to come up with that currency so that we're not sharing only half or partial truths. So what does Bacon give us? Well, he gives us the idea of faculty psychology, that the brain is divided into skills and talents, and that we're sort of limited to those skills and talents depending on how we develop them. He also gave us the study of with Baconian methods, which are inductive methods generally, which led to the deductive method of what we now refer to as the scientific method, and it's used across the globe. So that's where he led us. And then he said, by the way, any truths that you find may be limited by your own thought process, your cave, your den of knowledge, or because we're human and we can only do so much, or because we have believed the same thing for so long that there's no way we can get out of believing that thing, and therefore we're not actually going to find truth because we're too trapped in what we think we know. And finally, language limits us, which is a fairly obvious thing, actually. So if we start to look at all new truths, philosophy, science, etc., we can probably make sure that we're not being limited by those four. So he sort of makes us aware of the things that limit our knowledge. And he doesn't tell us how to get over them, but he certainly highlights what they are and where they come from. So that's what you've read, or that's what you're about to read, whichever way it goes. And the medieval period I'm sorry, it's not fun. Renaissance fairs are, though. So we're going to move into the Renaissance. We're starting to get there now, and that's where we're going to be next week. So hope your readings are going well. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you soon.